Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever told in the Appalachian Mountains. What we're going to talk about today will change the way you see shadows. In some places, silence is heavier than the air, and in others, the trees are so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. There has always been this kind of feeling in the Appalachians, like something old is watching and waiting among the mountains. In the early 1900s, specifically in 1902, a story began to spread through the small towns of West Virginia. There was a story about a shadow that whispered before dawn. It wasn't meant to scare people. It was a warning that was passed down from generation to generation around campfires. Back then, the mountain villages were almost cut off from the rest of the world. The roads were dangerous paths. It took days for people to talk to each other, and everyone had to rely on each other to stay alive. Life was hard, but it had a rhythm and a sense of order until something started to break that rhythm. People who lived on small farms in different parts of Pocahontas County said they saw something strange in the hours before dawn. It wasn't something that could be clearly seen, but it was there. A shadow that moved against the rules of light, seemed to watch through windows, and left strange marks on the doors of barns and houses. The stories were always the same. They would get up just before sunrise, when it was still dark, but the morning was already coming. Then they would hear it, a low whisper that was almost too quiet to hear, as if someone outside was saying things that couldn't be understood. When they finally got the guts to look through the cracks in the windows, they only saw a dark shape that was too tall to be a person standing there, not moving at all. And the worst part? It was never in the same spot twice. It might be next to the well 1 minute, and then, when you look again, it might be leaning against the wall of the house. The people in the community tried to find logical reasons. Maybe they were wild animals, like bears coming down from the mountains to look for food. They could have been lost travelers who got confused by the thick fog that covered the valleys. But when the details were looked at, these theories fell apart. Animals didn't leave marks on wood from their long toes. When the light finally broke the horizon, travelers didn't just disappear. And no one, not a single person, could explain the whispers, those words that seemed to come from everywhere at once and made your skin crawl and your heart race. Fear started to take over. Families stayed up all night with flashlights and shotguns, watching from their windows. Some people tried to face the presence and left their homes when they heard the whispers. But every time they did, all they found was the emptiness of the early morning and a cold that went all the way to the bone, even on summer nights. The shadow never spoke, never attacked, and only watched. And that made it even scarier, because there was no reason, no pattern, only the knowledge that something was there, waiting for something that no one could understand. Weeks went by, and the presence kept coming to the empty homes in Pocahontas County. The pattern stayed the same, always before dawn, always with those strange whispers, and always leaving behind only the memory of a cold that shouldn't be there. Some of the residents started to make their own protective rituals. Some were based on old customs brought from faraway places, while others were made up on the spot out of a strong desire to do something, anything, to keep that thing away. Some people hung horseshoes on their doors. People put salt on their windowsills in different places. Some people said prayers out loud all night. Some families drew signs on the outside walls of their homes that were supposed to keep bad spirits away. But none of that really seemed to help. The shadow picked its victims at random, going after both people who tried to protect themselves and those who tried to ignore it. It was like it was testing something, looking at the people who lived in those mountains with endless patience. A very cold winter hit the Appalachians in 1903. The snow made the trails harder to get to, which made the communities even more cut off. It was during these cold months that the shadow became more active. Now, it didn't just visit a few properties. It went to almost every farm within a few miles. The reports kept coming in, always consistent and always describing the same impossible figure that broke the rules of nature. Some people said it had grown, that it was now even taller, and that its shape was stretching unnaturally against the dark sky before dawn. It was at this time that the first ideas about what the shadow really wanted came out. Some thought it was looking for something that had been lost, a soul stuck between worlds and unable to find peace. Some people thought it was a punishment, a kind of cosmic justice for something that went wrong in that area a long time ago. Some people thought the shadow had no purpose at all. They thought it was just an oddity, a hole in reality where something from another place could show up for a short time, always between night and day. What made it even more disturbing was that the shadow had never hurt anyone in real life. There was no violence or direct aggression, just that constant presence, those whispers that seemed to have meanings that people couldn't understand, and that coldness that went deeper than any natural temperature. People started to get sick, not because they were hurt, but because they were tired, couldn't sleep, were always afraid, and felt like they were being watched, even when they couldn't see anything. It wasn't meant for the human mind to handle this kind of stress forever. People started to meet in the small churches that were spread out across the mountains. People got together to talk about their problems, find comfort in each other's company, and look for a group solution. But the more they talked, the more they understood that they were dealing with something that couldn't be explained in any normal way. There were no rules for the shadow. It didn't make sense according to any known rules. It just existed, showing itself in those short moments before sunrise. Everyone who saw it knew for sure that there were things in the world that people would never be able to fully understand. And the most disturbing thing was that it was still there, waiting, whispering its secrets to the darkness that would soon be eaten by the light of day. In the spring of 1904, things got better for a while. The shadow's visits seemed to happen less often as the thaw came, and life returned to the mountains. They didn't go away completely, but they were less common and more spaced out. The people who lived there started to breathe a little easier, thinking that maybe the worst was over. Some people even had the guts to say that it was all just a seasonal thing, something that happened because of the harsh winter that had finally given way to warmth and new life. But people who knew the mountains better knew that this calm was only on the surface. It was hard to put into words, but there was a feeling in the air that couldn't be ignored. It was as if the shadow hadn't gone away, but had only moved back for a while to watch from a distance, waiting for the right time to come back. People were still careful and stayed inside during the important hours before dawn, when they were still following their rituals and protections. Something had changed at its core in those communities after the event. They had learned that the world was much stranger and harder to understand than they had thought. During this time of relative peace, older stories started to come out. Elders who didn't talk about the past very often started to tell stories they had heard from their own grandparents. They said that the shadow wasn't new, but rather a presence that had been in those mountains for generations. There were apparently vague records of similar sightings decades before, always happening in the same way, at the same times, and leaving the same trail of silent terror. These new pieces of information made people even more uneasy. If the shadow was something that came back over and over again, then its current absence didn't mean anything. It was just a break before it came back. More and more theories about what the entity was like kept coming up. Some people thought it was connected to the earth itself, to the old mountains that had seen many generations of life and death. It could have been a guardian or something much worse, a force that fed on the energy of the living without ever really touching them. Some people thought the shadow was a portal, a way for something from another dimension to look into our world. They thought this could only happen during the short times when the barriers between realities were weakest, like when night turned into day. Summer came, bringing long days and short nights, and with it a feeling of normalcy that had almost been lost. The crops grew, families went back to their normal lives, and life in the mountains went back to normal. But those who had looked into the eyes of mystery and felt the shadow so close were never the same again. They all left with an invisible mark. The knowledge that reality was much bigger and more complicated than anyone could have imagined. They knew that there are things that are beyond light, touch, and understanding. And this knowledge was both a curse and a strange kind of knowledge. People always talked about the same thing on the porch during warm summer nights. What was the shadow? Where did it come from? Why had it picked those particular mountains and those small, remote towns? And the most frightening question of all, when would it come back? Because everyone knew, deep down, that it would come back. The shadow wasn't done with them yet. It was just waiting somewhere out of sight of people, counting the days until the time was right for it to show up again. And when that time came, it would be there again, whispering its secrets in the dark before dawn. The fall of 1905 painted the mountains in red and gold, but it also brought a feeling of unease that no one could put into words. It was as if the air was thick with anticipation, as if the land knew something that the people who lived there didn't. The nights started to get longer again, and with them came that familiar feeling of being weak. Once again, the people who lived on the isolated farms locked their doors, checked their windows more than once before going to bed, and kept their lanterns on all night. The whispers came back on a foggy morning in October. They weren't on all the properties at once like they were during the harsh winter. This time, the shadow seemed to be picking its targets more carefully, going to one farm here and another there, always following a pattern that no one could fully figure out. But now things were different. Reports said that the whispers had changed tone and become more demanding, almost urgent, as if the being was trying to say something important but still couldn't find a way to say it in a way that humans could understand. During this time, some people started having scary dreams. In their dreams, they walked through the thick forests of the Appalachian Mountains in the middle of the night, following a voice that called their names in a way that made them feel uneasy. In the dreams, they followed this voice until they got to clearings where the moonlight couldn't get through, and the darkness was so thick it felt like it was solid. And in the middle of all this darkness was the shadow, which was bigger than anyone had ever seen it. Its shape reached up to the sky as if it were trying to reach the stars. These people remembered every detail of their dreams perfectly when they woke up, but they couldn't figure out what they meant or why they felt so real. People in the community started to understand that the shadow wasn't just a passive presence that watched and then disappeared. There was a reason for its appearances, a goal that was always out of reach and frustrating. It was like trying to figure out a language that was completely foreign to you, where every word could mean 1,000 different things or nothing at all. Some people in the area started writing down every sighting, every whisper, and every strange feeling in a diary, looking for patterns that might lead to some hidden truth. But as they got more information, the phenomenon became more complicated and hard to understand. That winter, the relationship between the people who lived in the mountains and the shadow changed in a big way. The first fear had turned into something more complicated, a mix of fear and interest, disgust and curiosity. Some people started to wonder if the thing was really evil, or if it was just so different from what people are used to that it couldn't be judged by the same standards. Maybe the shadow wasn't trying to scare anyone. It was just being itself, which was strange and hard for people to understand, but not necessarily hostile. This change in point of view gave them new strength. People started to walk towards the windows when they heard the whispers. They didn't hide. Instead, they looked more closely at the dark shape, trying to make out details that panic had made hard to see. The more they watched, the more they noticed that the shadow seemed to react to this attention. It didn't do so in a clear or direct way, but through small changes in its behavior, as if it knew it was finally being seen for who it was and not just feared. It was the start of something new, a basic effort to understand each other between two kinds of life that might never fully understand each other, but that might be able to learn to live together in the same space and time. In 1906, snow fell again, covering the mountains and turning the Appalachian landscape into a deep, white silence. But this winter was different from the ones before it. The stress that had been building in the community started to turn into something more like acceptance. People still locked their doors and kept an eye on things at night, but when the whispers started, they didn't look as scared. It was as if they had come to a quiet agreement with the shadow, a kind of truce where neither side had to fight to prove their point. During this time, people began to call themselves observers. These were people who had decided to spend their nights studying the entity and writing down every sighting with the care of someone who was facing something bigger than themselves. They saw small patterns that had gone unnoticed before. The shadow never showed up on full moon nights, always stayed away from places with a lot of artificial light, and seemed to like being near bodies of water like streams and small lakes that were scattered throughout the mountains. These people also saw that the whispers weren't totally random. There was a rhythm, almost like music, but there was no clear melody. It sounded like the shadow was singing a lullaby from a place where sound waves worked in a completely different way. Some people started to remember these sounds so they could make them again during the day. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't get that exact quality, that timbre that seemed to come from all sides at once. The way the residents and the presence interacted with each other started to change in ways that no one expected. Families would leave small gifts on their balconies before bed, not because they thought the shadow needed them, but as a way to show that they knew about it and respected its existence. Other people started talking to the darkness when it showed up, using calm and polite voices, as if they were talking to a shy neighbor who didn't want to be around them. No one knew if the shadow understood these attempts to talk to it, but the act itself seemed to bring comfort, as if they were doing something instead of just reacting in fear. But not everyone agreed with this new way of looking at things. Some people thought that getting to know the entity better was a dangerous mistake that could have terrible results. They said that making something so fundamentally foreign normal was like opening a door that might not be able to be closed again. These doubters stuck to their usual defenses and wouldn't look out the window when the whispers started. They said that the best thing to do was to completely ignore the shadow and hope it would lose interest. These different ways of doing things caused a quiet split in the communities. There was no open hostility, but it was clear that people had picked sides on an issue that no one really understood. And while they argued about the best way to deal with the strange, the shadow kept coming, ignoring their conversations and keeping its mysterious rhythm, incomprehensible whispers, and presence that couldn't be put into words. It was like it lived on a different level than people, with its own schedule that only it understood, and time that moved in a way that was different from human time. And maybe some people thought during the long winter nights, this was the most important thing about the shadow. It didn't care about anything people did or thought, because it was so far away from human experience that any attempt to connect with it would always be incomplete and frustrating. There was an unexpected change in the spring of 1907. There were wildflowers growing between the rocks on the mountain. The birds came back and sang their morning songs. Something changed in the very nature of the shadow's appearances. The visits happened more often, but were shorter, as if the being were speeding up a process that only it knew about. People watching saw that it no longer stayed still for long periods of time. Instead, it moved more smoothly, gliding between trees and around buildings with a grace that was both beautiful and very disturbing. During this time, a new group of people began to appear in the mountain communities. These were people who had heard stories about the shadow as children, but had never seen it for themselves. For these younger people, the entity was almost like a myth. It was a story their parents and grandparents told, but it seemed more like a legend than something that really happened. This difference in generations made things interesting. The older people treated the shadow with a mix of respect and caution because they had seen it before. The younger people, on the other hand, were almost scientifically curious about it and wanted to understand, categorize, and explain it. Someone with a restless mind and maybe reckless courage was one of these young people who decided to do something that no one else had done before. On a clear May morning, when the whispers started outside his window, this person not only saw the shadow through the glass, but also opened the door and went outside. People who talked about this experience later, in shaky but determined voices, said they felt like they were stuck between two worlds. This person was completely surrounded by the shadow's coldness, but it wasn't freezing cold. It was more like being in freezing water that somehow let you breathe normally. When the shadow saw that it had been directly confronted, it did not back down. It didn't move, though. Its shape swayed slightly, like smoke caught in a breeze that couldn't be seen. The whispers got stronger, not in volume, but in presence, as if each word that was hard to understand was being carved directly into the listener's mind. And then, for a short time that felt like forever, there was a connection. It wasn't talking in the usual way. There was no talking or clear ideas, but both people understood that they were alive. The shadow knew the person in front of it, and the person knew that they were in the presence of something that went beyond their understanding of reality. As the sun rose and painted the sky with pink and orange hues, the shadow faded away like it always did. This time, though, it left something behind. It wasn't something that could be touched or looked at. It was more of an impression, a mark on the mind of anyone who had the guts to come near. That person spent the next few days trying to explain what they had felt, but they found it hard to do so because human language isn't good enough to describe something that happened outside of normal perception. It was like trying to tell someone who had never seen colors what they were, or someone who had never heard music what it was. People in the communities quickly heard about this direct interaction. Some people thought the act was brave and necessary to connect the known and the unknown. Some people thought it was dangerous and irresponsible, a provocation that could wake up parts of the shadow that should stay asleep. But no matter what people thought, something important had changed. There was no going back after crossing the invisible line that kept people and the entity on opposite sides of it. In the weeks that followed, more people tried to do the same thing. Not everyone, as many still wanted to keep their distance, but enough to change the way things worked. The shadow didn't seem to get less mysterious or more understanding when people tried to get closer. Instead, it showed a kind of patience that hadn't been there before. It was like it had been waiting for this moment all along, waiting for people to get over their initial fear and really try to understand instead of just reacting. People who listened without being scared started to hear the whispers in a different way. They were still hard to understand, still had that quality of coming from a place that was hard to understand. But now there were subtleties that had not been noticed before. They were sad, and the deep sadness made it seem like the shadow was as alone as people felt before it. There was also curiosity and a need to connect that was exactly what the people who lived in the mountains were starting to feel. Summer nights were short and hot, which made ghosts less likely to show up. But this absence was now felt in a different way. Before, there had been relief. Now, there was a strange kind of longing, a question of where the shadow went when it wasn't on that plane of existence. People started to understand that they had gotten used to it being there, that it had become a part of their lives in a way that no one could have predicted years ago when the first visits scared them so much. It taught me how to adapt, how something amazing can become normal with time and exposure, but never lose its sense of wonder and mystery. In the fall of 1908, the long and mysterious relationship between the Appalachians and the shadow that whispered before dawn changed. The trees dropped their leaves in golden spirals, making the mountain paths feel like they were covered in a crisp carpet that crackled underfoot. There was a feeling in the air that something big was about to happen. The most dedicated watchers had seen small changes in the entity's behavior over the past few months. Small changes in its patterns that suggested it was evolving or getting ready for something that no one could have predicted. The apparitions now moved in time with each other, like a cosmic dance between presence and absence that seemed to respond to the cycles of the moon and stars in ways that made no sense. The shadow would visit several homes in a row on some nights, moving through the mountains at an impossible speed and leaving a trail of whispers that echoed through the valleys like a ghostly chorus. And on other nights, especially when the stars were especially bright, it was completely gone, as if it were going to appointments in places that people couldn't even begin to imagine. During this time, a person in the community became known as the translator. This wasn't an official title. It was just a nickname for someone who seemed to have a special sensitivity to the patterns of the shadow. This person spent hours in the early morning not only watching, but also trying to feel and adjust their mind to the strange frequency that the entity gave off. And slowly, through a process that couldn't be taught or repeated, they started to see bits of meaning in the whispers that had seemed completely random before. These weren't words in the usual sense. They were more like thoughts, feelings, and pictures that came to mind like reflections in dirty water. The translator talked about seeing places that weren't on any map, like landscapes where geometry worked in ways that made your eyes hurt trying to understand them, and skies filled with colors that didn't have names in any human language. There were also feelings of time moving in many directions at once, of moments that were both past, present, and future, all happening at the same time. It seemed like the shadow wanted to tell you about its life. But this experience was so different from a human one that only the most basic parts could get through the barrier between two very different ways of living. Some people were interested in the translator's interpretations, while others were worried. Some people thought that these revelations could help people understand more about the nature of reality than traditional science and philosophy ever could. But there were also people who were afraid that going too deep into the mysteries of the shadow could have unexpected effects, that some doors should stay closed for good reason, and that the human mind wasn't meant to hold knowledge that was so big and strange. As winter drew near again, the observation sessions turned into group events. Small groups of people would gather on the farms that the shadow often visited and hold silent vigils, each person dealing with the experience in their own way. Some people meditated in order to reach a different state of mind that might help them see things more clearly. Others just watched, letting the entity's presence surround them without trying to understand it. And some people wrote down everything in great detail, hoping that one day they would be able to fully understand what they had written. It was on one of these cold December nights that the shadow did something it had never done before. Instead of keeping its normal, tall, undefined shape, it started to break up, forming several smaller versions of itself that danced around the people watching like leaves caught in a whirlwind. The whispers grew louder, making a symphony of impossible sounds that made the air vibrate with frequencies that could be felt in the bones. For a moment that lasted only a few heartbeats but felt like it went on for hours, all the pieces came back together to make something that looked almost like a person, but was so distorted that it was hard to tell where the shadow ended and where the night itself began. Everyone who was there was shocked into silence by this event. There were no good words to describe what they had seen, and there was nothing in their own lives that could help them understand that moment. It seemed like the shadow had chosen to show a bigger part of its true self, giving people a glimpse of something that was usually hidden behind the thin veil of reality that everyone thought was real. And with this new information came the overwhelming realization that the universe was far bigger, stranger, and full of unexplored possibilities than any human philosophy had ever thought. In the days after this strange event, it seemed like everyone in the community was going through something deep. People talked in low voices. People looked at each other in a way that showed they understood that their experiences had changed them. The fear that the shadow had caused at first had been replaced by something much more complicated, a mix of awe, unending curiosity, and a deep respect for things that were beyond human understanding. They had learned to accept the mystery and the unknown as a natural part of a reality that was much bigger than any human mind could fully understand. The shadow kept coming back, but this time people didn't scream. Instead, they were quiet and respectful. The people who lived in the mountains had become the keepers of a secret that had been passed down through the ages. They had seen something that couldn't be explained, but had made their lives better in ways they could never have imagined. And as the cold winter winds whistled across the Appalachian peaks, bringing with them the promise of more long, dark nights, everyone knew the shadow would be there, whispering its incomprehensible secrets to those brave enough to listen, offering glimpses of truths that existed on the fringes of human perception, where reality dissolved into infinite possibilities. No one could have predicted the changes that would happen in the winter of 1909, when the shadow first started to show up years before. The Appalachian Mountains were covered in a thick layer of snow that sparkled in the starlight. It looked like the scene was stuck between the real world and something much more ethereal. The isolated communities had completely changed how they felt about the strange being that came to their homes in the early hours before dawn. What started as pure fear had changed into layers of understanding, acceptance, and finally a kind of communion that couldn't be put into any of the usual categories. The translator kept trying to figure out what the whispers meant during this time, but he did it in a different way. This person learned to let the impressions flow through their mind without trying to make sense of them through intellectual analysis. And it was through this strange act of giving up that the most important truths began to come to light. The shadow wasn't trying to tell people specific things like people do. Instead, it was trying to share experiences of existence that were completely different from how people think about reality. It was like trying to explain dreams to someone who had never slept, or music to someone who had never heard it. The visions that came to mind during these times of deep connection were both amazing and scary. There were pictures of libraries that went on forever, with each book holding the whole history of a different universe. Places where time and space were just ideas and not hard and fast rules. Dimensions where minds could exist without bodies, moving through landscapes made of pure thought and frozen feelings. The translator tried to share these experiences with the other people in the community, but it was always hard because of the basic problem with human language. It was made to describe a world of solid objects and linear events, not the ever-changing nature of other realities. When more people let themselves interact directly with the shadow, interesting patterns started to show up. It was as if the entity were changing how it showed itself to match the unique frequencies of each person's consciousness, because each person seemed to get a slightly different impression. For some, the whispers brought back memories of places they had never been, longings for times they had never lived, and links to different versions of themselves that lived in different timelines. Some people felt like they were part of something much bigger, like they were individual threads in a cosmic tapestry that was so big that the human mind could only understand the tiniest bits of it. The elders of the community, who had seen everything from the first scary appearances to the current state of complex coexistence, started to think that the shadow was some kind of traveler. Not a traveler in the sense of someone who goes from one place to another, but something that moved through the layers of reality, like how people walk from one room to another in a house. From this point of view, the Appalachian Mountains were just a crossroads, a place where the barriers between worlds were naturally thinner, letting the shadow show up in part on the physical plane where people live. When the timing of the appearances was taken into account, this theory became more believable. Always before dawn, always at that time of day when night turns into day, darkness turns into light, and sleep turns into wakefulness. It was as if the shadow needed these changing conditions to stay stable, times when reality itself was changing, making it easier to move from one form of existence to another. The most dedicated observers started to see connections between the entity and astronomical events, like subtle alignments of planets and certain phases of the moon that seemed to make the entity's ability to show up more or less clear. Something strange happened on one of those really intense nights of manifestation, when the stars shone with an almost supernatural brightness, and the air was so still that each breath seemed to echo through the mountains. The shadow looked the same as it always did, but it also brought with it what could only be called echoes from other places. People who were watching it began to see ghostly shapes around it. These were flashes of impossible landscapes that appeared and disappeared like reflections in churning water. There were cities made of pure light, forests where trees grew upside down toward oceans that were really skies, and deserts where every grain of sand held whole galaxies spinning in their own cosmic dances. These visions only lasted a few seconds, but they left a lasting mark on everyone who saw them. It was like the shadow had chosen to share bits of its journey, giving people small glimpses into the places it had been and the lives it led when it wasn't in that corner of the Appalachians. And with these new pieces of information came a deep understanding of how big everything is, how many different ways reality can be, and how limited human perception is when faced with the true complexity of the universe. In the weeks that followed, everyone thought deeply about themselves. People walked silently along snowy paths, thinking about things that made them question everything they thought they knew about reality. People spoke in respectful tones, not because anyone had set rules for how to talk about these things, but because it seemed right to treat such important topics with respect and care. They felt like they had been chosen to see something amazing, like guardians of knowledge that went beyond generations and might never be fully explained or understood. The way people interacted in the mountain community started to change in small but important ways. The lines that used to separate people who liked the shadow from those who wanted to stay away from it started to fade. Even the most skeptical couldn't deny that something very strange was going on, something that needed to be thought about seriously no matter what their beliefs or philosophical views were. The night vigils turned into community rituals, not in a religious way, but as times when everyone came together to face the unknown and experience something that no one person could handle on their own. The translator, who had become a key player in this new phase of interaction, started to create a kind of symbolic language to try to capture the things they had in common. These weren't words in the usual sense. They were combinations of sounds, gestures, and pictures that tried to make people feel what they felt when they met the shadow. It was a simple, flawed system, but it was a real effort to connect the things that can be said and the things that can't, as well as direct experience and cultural transmission. Some younger people in the community started to learn this new language, starting a tradition that could be passed down to future generations. As spring came around again, bringing the thaw and the return of green life to the mountains, it felt like the relationship with the shadow was entering a new phase. The apparitions kept coming, but they felt less like visits and more like meetings between old friends who had something in common. The fear that had been there at first had turned into something that felt like love, but it was a strange kind of love for something that could never be fully known or understood. It was the kind of love you might feel for a huge, deep ocean, knowing how beautiful and powerful it is, but also knowing that its depths will always be a mystery. The whispers still echoed through the early mornings, but this time they were heard with a different kind of focus. Not as scary sounds that made people panic anymore, but as a kind of background music, a soundtrack for the change from night to day that had become a part of the rhythm of life in those mountains. Some people started to miss the whispers on the rare occasions when the shadow didn't show up, as if a key part of the soundscape had been taken away, leaving a hole that could only be filled by that one-of-a-kind presence. The shadow that whispered before dawn kept its mysterious watch as the seasons changed, and the Appalachian Mountains stood strong against the winds of time. This was a part of the identity of these remote communities, just like the mountains they called home. The people who lived there had learned a lot about living with the unknown, about finding beauty and meaning in things that couldn't be explained, and about accepting that some questions might never be answered, but that this didn't make them any less important. They learned that you didn't have to solve a mystery to enjoy it, that things that couldn't be explained had their own value, and that sometimes the journey of trying to understand was more important than getting to the end of the road of complete understanding. The shadow's appearances got stronger in the months after the spring of 1910, which no one had expected. It was as if the entity had realized that people were finally ready for deeper levels of interaction. The barrier of fear and misunderstanding had been broken down enough to let something more meaningful happen. The apparitions now happened with an almost regularity that more dedicated observers were starting to map with more and more accuracy. But with this regularity came a wider range of manifestations, as if the shadow were trying out different ways to show itself and see how far it could go without completely breaking down. During this time, stories started to come out about people's experiences that didn't make any sense. Some people said they walked through the shadow's shape, but not in the physical sense. Instead, they did it while they were sleeping or during deep meditation. During these encounters, they talked about feeling like they were in more than one place at the same time, and that time was not a straight line but a sphere where all moments were accessible from any point. They talked about conversations without words, where pure ideas were exchanged that went beyond the need for language. They said that whole ideas could be sent in a single moment of telepathic connection. The translator, who had spent years trying to figure out what the shadow was, started to come up with theories that were almost philosophical and metaphysical. Based on what he saw and did, he thought that the entity was not a creature or being in the way that people think of those words. It was more like a dispersed consciousness, a kind of awareness that wasn't limited to one body but spread out across many dimensions at once. The shape he saw in the Appalachian dawns was only the smallest part of this consciousness, the tip of an iceberg that was too big for the human brain to see directly in its full form. When people thought about what the whispers were like, they started to believe this theory. Those who had spent countless hours listening to them carefully analyzed them and found layers of complexity that seemed to go on forever. There were other whispers inside each whisper, and they repeated themselves on smaller and smaller scales, like each sound was a whole universe with smaller universes inside it. Some people started to think that the whispers weren't really trying to communicate in the usual way, but were instead the very essence of the shadow's mind, the sound of its thoughts coming to life in the air of the mountains. As summer went on, and the nights became shorter but more starry, the community came up with more and more complicated ways to interact with the entity. Before the apparitions, groups of people started to sync up their minds by using breathing techniques and visualization to make something like a temporary group mind. The idea was that the shadow might be able to talk to a group mind better than to each person's mind. And surprisingly, this method seemed to work. During these synchronized sessions, several individuals reported having identical visions concurrently, experiencing the same sensations, and receiving analogous fragmented impressions of incomprehensible locations. On one of these group nights in August, when the air was thick with the promise of storms far away, the group had an experience that would later be called the Great Revelation. The shadow appeared as it always did, but this time it started to grow, getting bigger and more complex until it filled the whole sky above the mountains. And then, for a time that could have been seconds or hours, time stopped making sense. It began to open. There was no other way to put it. It was like invisible doors had been opened, letting everyone see the entity's true nature. What they saw was impossible to describe in any way that was good enough. There were infinite realities stacked on top of each other like pages in an endless book. There were infinite consciousnesses within consciousnesses. They didn't see the shadow as one thing. Instead, they saw it as a mix of many beings, forces, or principles, all of which were part of a complicated dance of existence that went beyond the categories of living or inanimate, material or spiritual, and individual or collective. It was like seeing the basic rules that made everything possible, from the tiniest particles to the biggest galaxies. And in that overwhelming vision, there was an understanding that came like a silent thunderclap. The shadow was not a visitor from another place. It was something that had always been there, woven into the very fabric of the universe, but most people couldn't see it. The Appalachian Mountains had the right kind of topography and energy to make a small part of that cosmic presence temporarily visible. It felt like reality had thin spots, places where the line between what you could see and what you couldn't see was naturally more clear. And those mountains were one of those rare places. No one spoke for a long time after the vision faded, and the group returned to normal consciousness. They were thinking about an experience that had changed the way they saw the world in a big way. Some people cried quietly, but not because they were sad. They were crying because they were so happy and full of respect. Some people just looked at the stars with new eyes and saw not just distant points of light, but also windows to endless possibilities of life. The line between the ordinary and the extraordinary had been blurred for a short time, and everyone now had this mark in their minds. In the days and weeks after the big revelation, the community changed in a deep but quiet way. People went about their daily tasks with a different kind of presence, as if they were more aware of each moment, each breath, and each interaction. Even when talking about things that seemed unimportant, conversations became deeper than they had been before. Everyone knew that they all had an impossible secret that they couldn't easily explain to people who hadn't been there, but it brought them all together in a brotherhood of shared experience. The translator, who had spent years trying to figure out what the shadow was now in a strange situation. On the one hand, the big revelation gave us more information and understanding than years of careful watching. On the other hand, it also showed once and for all how limited human understanding will always be. It was like trying to hold an ocean in a teacup. You could get a few drops, look at what they were made of, and learn a little about what they were like, but you could never really hold the ocean itself. The translator then stopped trying to explain or categorize things and instead focused on helping others have their own direct experiences with the mysterious presence. As the colors of fall returned to the mountains, the shadow's appearances changed. It seemed like the great revelation had changed it. Or maybe it had finally reached a goal it had been working toward since it first appeared years ago. The whispers now had a musical quality that made it sound like they were happy. In the early morning, the way it looked seemed more stable and comfortable, as if it had finally found the right balance between showing too much and not showing enough. People from other mountainous areas started to come to Pocahontas County during this time. These people had heard rumors about the strange things that were happening there. Some people came with doubt, ready to prove that what they thought was superstition or mass hysteria was wrong. Some people came with hope, looking for experiences that would take them beyond what they had in their own lives. And surprisingly, the shadow seemed to be able to show itself to all of them, changing its look in ways that made sense to each new person who saw it, no matter what they had thought or expected before. Because it could change based on how people saw it, new ideas about what the entity was came up. It may not have had a set shape, but it was more like a cosmic mirror that showed the observer parts of their own mind. Or maybe it was something even more complicated, an intelligence so big and varied that it could show different sides to different people at the same time, each side being real, but none showing the whole thing. It was like the old story of blind people who touch different parts of an elephant and come to different conclusions. Each one was right in their own way, but none of them told the whole truth. Winter had come again, with its blanket of snow and long nights that were great for deep thought. The vigils went on, but instead of being tense investigations, they were now quiet celebrations. The people in the community had learned to just be around the shadow without having to think about it or talk about it all the time. They learned that it was good to let some things stay mysterious, and that some experiences were better when they weren't broken down into their most basic parts. There was a beauty in the inexplicable that would be lost if it were forced into standard ways of thinking about things. The seasons went on with their never-ending cycle. The shadow kept watch in the hours before dawn, and the people who lived in the Appalachian Mountains lived their lives enriched by something that was beyond words. They had become protectors of something that didn't fit into any category, and they had seen truths that went beyond what most people knew. And in this role, they found a kind of purpose that few people anywhere or at any time managed to discover. The certainty that they were part of something infinitely greater than themselves, connected through that mysterious entity to vast expanses of existence that the human mind could scarcely begin to imagine. In the years that followed, the Appalachian communities completely changed how they thought about the shadow that whispered before dawn. What had started as scary encounters with the unknown had turned into something that went beyond simple categories of fear or interest. It was a way of life that was as natural as the sunrise, and as much a part of the seasons as the mountains themselves, which marked the passage of time in those ancient and imposing mountains. The entity kept showing up in ways that were both comforting and strange. Every morning there was a chance to meet someone. Every night, there was that strange feeling of looking forward to being around something that wasn't real. The whispers became a part of the mountain soundscape, just like the wind through the pines or the distant song of birds that come out at night. But even though they were familiar with them, they never completely lost their strangeness. That constant reminder that the universe had depths that the human mind could never fully understand. The translator, who was now known as a kind of bridge between people and the mysterious presence, had gained an understanding that went far beyond any attempt to put things into groups or explain them. It was no longer about figuring out what people were saying or figuring out how often they showed up. It was about getting into a state of openness that let you connect with others directly. It was a kind of wisdom that didn't come from learning a lot of things, but from being able to just be there without having to put everything through limiting ideas. And this wisdom was freely given to anyone who really wanted to improve their relationship with the shadow. During these years of living together, traditions began to form that will probably be passed down to future generations. There were quiet rituals of observation that happened at certain times of the year. These were times when everyone in the community came together not to try to make things happen, but just to honor the presence that had become such a big part of their lives. People at these events showed a kind of respect that wasn't religious in the usual sense, but it was deep in the same way that seeing something truly amazing makes you feel like you are part of it. People started to hear stories about the shadow that went beyond the mountains where it all started. People who traveled told these stories to people in faraway villages, where they got different reactions. Some people thought the stories were just superstitions or exaggerations that came from living in the mountains. Some people were very curious and wanted to experience what was being described for themselves. Some people saw echoes of their own strange experiences in the stories, different in specific details but similar in essence, leading them to think that maybe the world was stranger and more amazing than most people thought it was. As time went on, the community learned more about what the apparitions were like. They figured out that the shadow didn't always show up in the same way. There were times when the apparitions were very common and had a revealing quality that changed everyone who saw them. There were also times when the presence was less noticeable, almost unnoticeable, as if it were focusing on other places or other aspects of existence. They learned to respect these natural cycles and realized that trying to get people to interact during quiet times was less effective than just waiting for times when things were more active. People's experiences with the shadow continued to be very different, and each person formed their own special bond with the being. Some people said that the apparitions brought out creative abilities they didn't know they had. They made art, music, and poetry that tried to capture the strange, transcendent quality of their experiences. These works never fully captured the experience, but they were imperfect bridges between what could be said and what couldn't be said, giving others small glimpses of what couldn't be said directly. Some people saw the manifestations as a way to learn deep philosophical truths. The shadow made people question what reality, consciousness, and existence really are. What did it mean to be alive in a universe where things like this could happen? How to balance the knowledge that whole dimensions of existence usually stay hidden with the need to live a normal life. These questions were not simple to answer, but just thinking about them made conversations richer and deeper than they usually are in more traditional communities. Some people also found a strange kind of comfort in meeting the shadow. Knowing that the universe was much bigger and stranger than it looked on the surface made everyday problems seem less bad. The knowledge that reality goes far beyond the limits of normal human experience helped me see problems that seemed impossible to solve in a new light. It was a strange kind of humility that made each person feel less important, while also connecting them to something much bigger. As the seasons went on with their never-ending cycle, the apparitions began to change in a small but important way. The whispers, which had been completely impossible to understand for so long, started to carry bits that almost made sense. They weren't really words, but clearer ideas and impressions that got through the barrier between two very different types of consciousness. It was as if, after years of patient interaction, both humans and the shadow had come up with a simple language that worked for both of them. A way to talk to each other that was somewhere between their own ways of living and communicating. Some people hoped or feared that these new forms of communication would reveal great cosmic truths or forbidden knowledge. Instead, they communicated something much simpler and deeper, a feeling of mutual recognition, an acknowledgement that both sides of this unlikely interaction were aware of each other in ways that went beyond just seeing each other. It was as if the shadow were saying, in its roundabout way, that it saw people just as clearly as they saw it. This meant that the observation was mutual, and that neither side was just an object for the other, but both were subjects in an encounter of mutual meaning. This revelation completely changed the way the community thought about its relationship with the entity. They were no longer just passive observers of something they couldn't understand. They were now active participants in a conversation that went beyond normal language. Every ghost turned into a conversation. Each whisper was an attempt to communicate that, even though it wasn't perfect, it was real. And with this understanding came an unspoken duty, to stay open, receptive, and willing to keep trying to understand, even if full understanding might never be possible. The years went by like leaves blown by the wind over the mountains. Each season brought its own challenges, rhythms, and unique qualities. The community changed and grew. New people were born who already knew the stories of the shadow. Meanwhile, the elders who had seen the first scary apparitions left, taking with them their vivid memories of those early days. But the presence stayed the same through all of the changes that people went through. It was a constant in a life that was always changing. It was strange how the shadow had become so much a part of the identity of these mountain communities. It was a part of their history that helped them figure out who they were and where they fit in the world. Kids heard stories about the apparitions as they were growing up, which helped them understand that reality was much bigger and stranger than it seemed at first. This awareness changed the way they thought in small but important ways, making them more open to new ideas than most people in other places. And then, in a cycle that seemed to follow the same patterns that had been set over the years, the intensity of the manifestations slowly started to fade. They didn't go away completely, but they happened less often and were less vivid, as if the shadow was slowly pulling back, doing something that only it knew about. The community didn't panic or get too sad as this slow withdrawal happened. Instead, there was a quiet acceptance that everything goes in cycles, that people come and go, and that nothing stays the same forever. The most dedicated watchers thought that maybe the shadow had gotten what it wanted by interacting with the people who lived in those mountains. Maybe its goal from the start was to be truly seen, recognized, and accepted without being terrified. Or maybe it was just moving forward, through the endless layers of reality, toward other places, other dimensions, and other encounters that were waiting in parts of the universe that people could barely imagine. The community didn't forget about the apparitions as they became less common. Instead, they added them to their shared history in ways that would make sure they would be remembered for a long time. People told and retold stories, each time adding new layers of meaning while keeping the main points the same. Even on nights when the shadow didn't show up, the rituals of observation went on. They turned into celebrations of the very idea of mystery, and the fact that something extraordinary could happen at any time. And when the shadow did show up, which was very rare, people were overjoyed and nostalgic, as if they were meeting an old friend again after a long time apart. When the whispers came, they had tones that could be seen as a goodbye, a promise to come back, or just an acknowledgement that some stories have to end even if the bigger ones go on forever. The Appalachian Mountains stood strong under skies that changed with the seasons, silently watching everything that happened over those amazing years. And in their thick forests, foggy valleys, and the time between night and day, there was still that feeling of possibility, that feeling that the lines between the visible and the invisible were not as clear-cut as most people thought. The shadow had taught these lessons without saying a word, just by being there and spending years patiently interacting with them, turning fear into understanding and ignorance into a strange and indescribable kind of wisdom. As the sun rose each morning over those old mountains, painting the skies with colors that were never quite the same twice, the people who lived there knew that they had been touched by something that was beyond what could be explained in words. They were keepers of memories that were too deep to put into words, and they had experiences that made their lives richer in ways that money or success could never match. They had seen things that most people would never have thought were real.